Wasn't expecting to speak in this big room with all these amazing people here, but welcome to our first Sustainability and Innovation Forum, and thank you for being with us today. As the president of the French-American Chamber of Commerce, I am delighted to welcome you here. I think eventually we'll be over 300, so that's a wonderful start for a new initiative focused entirely on sustainability and innovation and across several different industry sectors. For those of you who are not yet members of the French-American Chamber of Commerce, and I do hope that those very rare people will consider joining our dynamic organization very soon, I would like to just say a few words on the French-American Chamber of Commerce. Our mission is to help develop business opportunities between French and American companies and individuals. We provide numerous networking opportunities, interesting experiences, and learning events and webinars, which in turn facilitate understanding of the French and American business cultures. We enable successful business relationships between our over 1,000 members here in New York and over 5,000 members across 18 chapters in the United States. And we also help American companies looking to develop their business in France. Today's event is one of 45 that we do year after year, and delivering on such topics that range from women in business, luxury, fashion, beauty, food, beverage, hospitality, finance, technology, startups, immigration, and so on. At the FACC, we also provide other services. I'll only mention two. One is we are a leader in providing J1 visas, over 1,000 visas year after year, allowing for in-depth cultural exchange for young French students or trainees coming to the US or Americans going to France. We also have created a few years ago the French-American Chamber of Commerce Foundation. This initiative is one of a kind, which is to provide scholarships to French and American students crossing the Atlantic to pursue their MBA or equivalent studies. We think this is absolutely exceptional because we have helped over 60 students, and that is really the best way to prepare for leadership business of tomorrow. We hope that this afternoon will provide you with valuable insights regarding sustainable business, as well as create lasting and productive business relationships. I would like to recognize and thank the French-American Chamber of Commerce team for their hard work in organizing this event, and mention Hanako Boulanger, who is in charge of events and the initiator of this forum, as well as Lindsay Prowse, who is the staff liaison for our Sustainability Committee, and of course, Martin Bischoff, who is not going to read anything while I'm talking, who is the head of our team. Thank you, Martin. So why sustainability? Of course, sustainability is now a key driver in innovation, faced with both pressure from international agreements and landmark reports on global warming. Sustainability-oriented innovation is driving business growth, creating new drivers between private and public sectors, and transforming strategy, products, and technologies. As a founder of a beauty startup recently said, customers are now expecting brands to be ahead of legislation. And according to a recent report from Clutch, 65% of shoppers that buy fashion expect companies to embrace corporate social responsibilities, and I think the percentage is even higher for beauty and, of course, other industries. We believe that collectively, as individuals and companies, we can effect positive change for a more sustainable future. I'd like to mention that we have recently formed a new committee. I referred to it before, the Sustainability Committee, and that will be focusing on events that will continue to create interesting topics across various sectors to empower, educate, and promote sustainable and innovative approaches. I'm going to mention the names of the members of the committee, and if they're here, I would just ask that they stand up. The chair of this committee is Skip Rankin, partner and chair, North America at Baker McKinsey. Skip is over there. He's also vice president of the French-American Chamber of Commerce. Thank you, Skip. You will hear more from him later. Philippe Karadec from Danone North America. Is Philippe here? Thank you. Anne Tracy at Colgate-Palmolive. Is Anne here? Not yet. Hans Thayer at Fairtrade America. Thank you. Hervé Oudré from H2 Consulting. Thank you, Hervé. Jean-Noël Poirier, Clean Energy Venture Group. Thank you. And Lindsay Prowse, who is our, as I mentioned before, staff liaison on this committee. And this committee is just one of several industry committees that we've already formed, including finance, luxury, technology, food and beverage, just to name a few. So this afternoon, the program should be up there soon. We're going to start with panel 1 on legislation and governance, and then we'll offer 2 simultaneous panels. Panel 2 on food, beverage, and hospitality, which will take place in this amphitheater, and at the same time, panel 3 on energy and transportation, which will take place in the room across upstairs, and I was told to point upstairs, as if we didn't know, but that's where it is. Please then wait for the break that follows that after the 2 simultaneous panels in order to network, and then head to the breakout room. After that, we'll have a fashion show, and then we will continue with the panel on luxury, fashion, and beauty, followed by our last panel on sustainable tips for individuals. Then you will be invited to enjoy a cocktail and networking reception on the terrace to close the day in this beautiful rain. So, but we're working on changing the weather forecast. Before I move on to our speakers, I'd like to thank our sponsors, 3 key sponsors that have supported today's program. KPMG as the Earth level sponsor. Thank you, KPMG. HSBC as the water level sponsor. And last but not least, the air, which obviously we cannot live without, BNP Paribas. So we value very much your support and help in organizing and supporting this event. I'd like to now introduce and welcome Hervé Dutreil, Chief Sustainability Officer, Managing Director, Head of Sustainable Finance and CSR Americas at BNP Paribas, for opening remarks before welcoming our keynote speaker. So please, Hervé, join me on the stage.
Good afternoon. How is everyone today? Asleep. I hope I will wake you up. I'm Hervé Dutreil, Chief Sustainability Officer for the Americas at BNP Paribas. Thank you for having me this privilege to address a few words to you. By way of introduction, I've not always been a CSO. It's a role I created about 5 years ago, but the 20 years that preceded, I was a trader or manager of traders. And if I may, on a personal note, I absolutely loved trading. I loved the technicity of capital markets. I loved the world of fixed income derivatives. And in my personal life, I also loved having a tangible impact on people around me, maybe in a more direct manner. I taught English to Rikers Island prisoners. I counseled pregnant teenagers. I set up a foundation and did many other things. But a little over 5 years ago, I found a way to marry both during the 10 hours or so I spent at the bank every day. And that was the beginning of a practice that we call sustainable finance. Many corporate leaders understand that business have a key role to play in tackling urgent challenges, be it climate change, biodiversity erosion, plastic pollution, water scarcity, or rising social inequalities. But many of those leaders also believe that pursuing a sustainable agenda runs counter to the wishes of their shareholders. As you will probably hear today, that perception is outdated. And in particular, because we are witnessing what I would call an investor revolution. Many factors can be attributed to this revolution among investors, but I would like to cite only one of them. And it's the fact that the investment industry is highly concentrated. Think about it. The top 5 asset managers are nearly handling 23% of all externally managed assets. the top 5 are nearly handling 25% basically of all money that's being managed by third parties. And the top 10, by the way, 34%. So large investment firms, such as BlackRock, for example, that has over $6 trillion in assets under management, those investment firms are so big that modern portfolio theory, which says, you know, if you diversify your portfolio, you mitigate risk. Well, they're so big that modern portfolio theory cannot be used to mitigate what I would call systemic risks. If you're a small investment firm, you might be able to hedge against climate change or any other systemic risk by investing in what I would call doom stocks, you know, like defense companies, or by buying gold. But when you have more than $6 trillion under management, there's not one single hedge against the global economy. And this is why, in short, those firms have become too big to let the planet fail. So what do they do? We've talked about investors. Well, in turn, they're pursuing corporates to be more sustainable, not to fail the planet, so that we do not fail portfolios. Now there is a good news for corporations. Becoming more sustainable typically means optimizing resource utilization, electricity, water, and so on. So this means for them to re-engineer processes. And in today's technological world, it usually means saving money. Indeed, I would say that the 21st century is an era when processes are becoming a source of value creation. What we used to call IT in the 90s, we now call digital, because we know how to monetize data. And what we used to call responsibility, responsible behaviors, responsible use of resources, I would today call it sustainability, because it's a source of economic value. So as bankers, we happen to sit in between investors and corporations that do run projects. And we have an opportunity to build the bridges between purposeful capital and impactful projects. That's what we've been doing over the last 5 years. It bears the name of social impact bonds, sustainability-linked loans, or sustainable supply chain financing. In all cases, all of a sudden, the cost of funding that used to be solely tied to the ability of the borrower to repay is now slightly dependent also on the ability of the borrower to do good. The better he does, or he or she does, the lower the interest rate, and conversely. So this is very exciting, but this is also very, very urgent, because it's no longer about saving the planet, it's actually about saving humanity. So as you embark on this day and this conference, I'd like to leave you with a quote by Jane Goodall, who's a primatologist, a word I didn't know, but I guess we can learn a lot from monkeys. And she writes, "You cannot go through a single day without having an impact on the world around you. Whatever you do make a difference. And you have to decide what kind of difference you want to make." Thank you.
Merci Hervé, thank you so much. I heard just now that it's important for business, that it also, sustainability impacts the cost of capital, but more importantly, that if we want to survive and want our children to have a planet to survive, this is not just a fad. This is one of the most important topics, if not the most, which is a wonderful segue in the honor I have to introduce our keynote speaker, Lise Kingo. Did I pronounce that right? Yes. CEO and Executive Director of the United Nations Global Impact. While you all have her resume, I would like to provide a brief summary and highlight just a few of Lisa's distinguished accomplishments. And that was probably the most difficult assignment I had in preparing for today, is just to take a few minutes and take a few excerpts, and I hope you will not be upset if I miss certain things that are key. So Lise is the CEO and Executive Director of the United Nations Global Impact, which is the world's largest sustainability initiative with more than 13,500 signatories from 170 countries. Prior to joining the UN Global Impact in 2015, Ms. Kingo was Chief of Staff, Executive Vice President, and member of the Executive Committee team at Novo Nordisk since 2002. Before that, she held various positions, and now I'm sure I'm going to butcher this, at Novo Siemens and Novo AS. Until Ms. Kingo started her work with UN Global Compact, she was also chair of the board of Steno Diabetes Center. She was professor at the medical faculty in Amsterdam and chair of the Danish Council for Corporate Social Responsibility. She has received several awards, such as the Edinburgh Medal and the Copenhagen Business School 2018 Honorary Alumni Award, and she is champion of UN, sorry, she is also a UN Gender Champion. I told you it was tough. Ms. Kingo has a Master of Science degree in Responsibility and Business Practice, as well as a degree in Science of Religions and Ancient Greek Culture, and in Commerce and Marketing Economics. She is also certified by INSEAD's International Directors Program in Corporate Governance. Please do review the detailed resume that we have provided and help me in welcoming Lise to this podium.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for the invitation. This is the most wonderful introduction I have had for a very long time. Congratulations on pronouncing all these strange words absolutely perfectly. It's great to be here today. And I think we have many reasons for picking the topic of responsible business, responsible investments, and also innovation. It's all very closely connected, and representing the United Nations Global Compact here today is a great pleasure, because we obviously have a lot to say about this topic in many different ways. But I mean, as always, let's start a good story from the beginning. This gentleman, former Secretary General of the United Nations, the late Mr. Kofi Annan, decided 19 years ago to do a special initiative to help give globalization a human face. He was speaking at the World Economic Forum in front of a huge group of business people, just like today, and suggested that the private sector and the UN formed a global compact to drive a more equal and a more human globalization. His idea was that if globalization doesn't benefit all, it benefits none. And I feel from only reading the newspapers today that his words have never been more relevant than they are today. So the initiative started with 40 very innovative companies. Today we are more than 10,000 companies, more than 3,000 organizations across the world that all adhere to UN Universal Principles on human rights, environment, labor, and anti-corruption. And almost 4 years ago, a new addition to the agenda for all our companies was the Sustainable Development Goals. In case they are unfamiliar to anyone in the room, I'll just leave all the nice 17 icons up there for you to take a very quick look at them. And what I want to do today is to give you a little bit of a backdrop on where the world is in actually making progress towards the goals. The idea is that by 2030, all the 17 goals, and there are more than 150 indicators, should be fulfilled. Less than 4 years ago, the 2030 agenda, including these 17 goals, and the Paris Climate Agreement was unanimously adopted at the UN. So this is a wonderful lighthouse and direction for the world to take when it comes to creating a world that leaves no one behind. There's no doubt that when you look at the goals and at the indicators behind the goals, they will never become a reality without businesses. And a sort of quick estimate is that at least half of the goals will require business engagement and business action. And that's why it's so important that we are gathered here today at the French-American Chamber of Commerce. So today, the UN Global Compact works through its 71 local networks across the world. For almost 4 years, we have been working together at making global goals local business. Because these 17 goals, they have to be put into action on the ground by businesses. They will not be fulfilled in nice meeting rooms like this one or down at the UN for that matter. So you get a feel here for how many companies our local networks are getting in touch with to create awareness, action, and partnerships on the goals. And it gives me particular pleasure to be here and just say a little bit about our local networks here in the US, but also in France. So our local network in France is among the oldest networks and the largest networks at the UN Global Compact. Together, we have more than 2,000 companies in both countries. And in France, I would say we find some of the most advanced companies in the world, some of the largest companies reporting to Compact at an advanced level. In France, they have been very busy rolling out the Sustainable Development Goals and are putting a special effort to reaching small and medium-sized companies at the moment. When it comes to the US, we have a wonderful local network here as well that have lately teamed up with the Thunderbird School of Management. So I think that will tell you all about the interest for innovation that we have at the Global Compact in making the goals a reality. And our network here are also among the first to launch a new program for young SDG innovators that are actually working in our member companies. So it's very exciting, and we are also very proud of these two particular networks. You can see some of the data up here. So is it a good business decision to join the UN Global Compact or to run your business in a responsible way in general? It definitely is, and I have brought just a few numbers to show you, actually from the Boston Consulting Group, that companies that are part of Global Compact, companies that follow a responsible business approach, have higher margins, have a higher market valuation, and have higher credit worthiness. I think several times today we will hear from the financial sector substantiating that this is the way of driving a company going forward if it should be successful from a financial point of view, but definitely also from a reputational point of view, reputation, and of course making sure that the company is in line with the consumers and the buyers of the products out there. Let me also show you that companies that can document a responsible business approach, climate, human rights, labor standards, are performing better in terms of their share price than companies with a more traditional business model. Here you can see two different indices. The just US index is only composed of companies with a responsible profile, and their share price is comparing much nicer to the Russell 1000 index, that is a more traditional index. A new development that we are very happy about at the Compact is that major financial institutions like BlackRock, JP Morgan, BNY Mellon have started using the UN Global Compact 10 principles to screen and scan the companies that they are putting forward in their new products to customers that are interested in investing only in responsible companies. So I think it's fair to say that what we have seen as a trend for many years now is really beginning to turn into mainstream. But let's look at how the world is faring after 4 years with the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. We don't have a lot of time this afternoon, so I will give you the one-liner on how we are faring in terms of progress and gaps. So there are many good stories to tell on how the world has progressed within the last 25 years and within the last 4 years. One of them is that 1 billion people have been lifted out of poverty. That's, of course, a major achievement, particularly happening in China and in Asia. Many more people have got access to electricity. Under 5 mortality has been halved. Many other really good progress on what is the more traditional development goals of UN priorities. So the first of the 17 goals are relating to these more traditional development goals and are progressing in positive ways. When it comes to risks, so what are the goals where we are faring significantly behind? There are 2 major areas. The one is climate, the other is inequality. On climate, we are significantly behind indicators and plans. If things go unchanged, we are looking at a 4-degree trajectory going forward, of which we have no real idea what the consequences are going to be. That is simply not acceptable. And for Mr. Guterres, the Secretary General of the UN, this is his major priority. And he will host his climate summit in September, where I hope to see many of you to really figure out how to change this trajectory and begin to see tipping points that the global CO2 emissions are coming down. This is clearly spilling over into the situations in the oceans that is becoming more and more serious. And when we look at inequalities, let me just mention, for example, that the gender equality gap in the world is widening. And at the moment, the estimate is that it will take 202 years before we have gender equality in the world. So, young people is another group that are suffering from inequalities. And we know that 22% of the 1.8 billion young people that we have in the world today don't have a job and doesn't have access to any kind of education. So clearly, this is asking for trouble. This is leading to instability in the world. And I think we all know as business people that stable markets are good markets. It's not easy to run a business in an unstable market. So there are many reasons why what is good for the world is, of course, also good for business. So at the Compact, we like to look at how risks can be turned into opportunities and how business can play a really important role. So, for example, I mentioned the gender gap a moment ago. It's interesting that there is a 28 trillion upside in terms of global GDP in closing the gender gap. The estimate from UNCTAD is that we need approximately $2.5 trillion every year from now to 2030 to make the 17 goals. We could make a huge step forward by closing the gender inequality gap, giving women across the world better access to the working market, making it possible for women to own land, to own assets. So a very interesting opportunity. Another major opportunity is in the energy space. There would be a $26 trillion upside in reverting into renewable energy. We could save hundreds of thousands of people from dying from air pollution and creating more than 65 million jobs in the low carbon energy sectors. So for business people, there's a lot of upsides in contributing to making the global goals a reality. So in my mind, these two options, should we change or should we pick the same road? I think option number 2 is out. There's no same route going forward. We have to change. But the good thing is that we actually know how we can change, because the 17 goals are sending a very clear signal of what can be a great innovation platform for all companies in the world. And the good news is that among Global Compact's companies across the world, large and small, in the global north, in the global south, we hear very clearly in our annual survey that 80% of these companies are already aware of the global goals and have picked them up, of course, in different ways across the world. The best practice companies are the ones that are using the goals as a strategic driver to innovate, to optimize and change business models, and to prepare the company for the next generation, where the millennials will be the key consumers and customers out there, and they want to buy products that comply with the 17 goals. What you see up here is a rating of which goals are the most popular among our companies. So you see the most popular, decent work and economic growth. Number 2, gender equality. It's actually good news that 80% of Global Compact companies have goals on gender equality. It's probably not radical enough to close the gender gap, I'm sure it's not, but it's definitely a good start. What we do at Compact in terms of some of the goals that are low on the list here, life underwater, the oceans, you can see is pretty low. So we have the opportunity to take action and create special initiatives that are really driving the agenda forward. So we launched a wonderful action platform for all businesses that work in the ocean space a year ago. And today we have some of the major companies in the world engaged in defining how we can get rid of plastics and how we can really improve the situation in the oceans. As you see up here, the global goals have become a CEO agenda. In the companies included in the survey, 68% of CEOs are personally engaged and driving the SDG agenda. This means it's a boardroom discussion. It means that it's a strategic innovation discussion, which we find extremely positive. Again, there are also other stakeholders that clearly need to be more involved. So disrupting business as usual is the way forward. And that's why I was so happy seeing that the title for today is all about innovation. I think it's fair to say that the kind of society that will embrace the global goals will have to be quite different from what we have today. It will not be fixed by incremental innovation. It will need significant breakthrough innovation, like introducing a young lady in the very, how should I say, traditional market sculpture down here at Wall Street. But I think it's something like this kind of change we will be looking at. Let me just end by giving you a few examples of the areas where we at Global Compact is working to create real innovation with companies inspired by the SDGs. So we work with companies, with the UN system, with stakeholders to nail down how to report on the SDGs, how to do breakthrough innovation, how to do financial innovation for the goals. And I was very happy to see SDG bonds up there as one good instrument. We work on water, on climate, on oceans, of course, very clearly connected. And we work on health, peace, justice, and strong institutions, and also, of course, on decent work in the supply chain. The interesting thing about the goals is that whatever goal you start with, you quickly get into all the other goals. They are just as interconnected and system-oriented as the real world is. So I decided to bring this photo of the Secretary General and a young woman from Sweden called Greta Thunberg, who has made it her case, her passion to make the world aware that we need to act on climate change now. So just a reminder that on September 23rd, everyone, all stakeholders will be at the UN to hopefully discuss breakthrough innovation, including the young generation at the UN. And I want to leave you with Gandhi's definition of what a real change agent is, for you to just think about if you are a real change agent or you could still do more to really drive this agenda. First, they will ignore you. Then they will laugh at you. Then they will fight you. And then you will win. It's probably this kind of leadership that we need throughout the world to really make the goals a reality. And I'm very happy to say that I am seeing many business leaders that are really living up to Mr. Gandhi's definition of being a change agent. But of course, we need many more on board. Thank you for your attention.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Martin Bischoff. I'm the Managing Director of the French-American Chamber of Commerce. Thank you all again for being with us today. Many thanks to Lise Kingo for her remarks and her presence with us this afternoon. It's now my pleasure to introduce our first panel on legislation and governance, shaping a sustainable future. I'd like to invite our panelists to join me on the stage. First, we have John Mandic, CEO of Urban Green. We have Kate Walsh, Head of Cities, States, and Regions at CDP. We have Anne Lestrade, former Deputy Mayor of Paris and Chairwoman of Eau de Paris. With Patricia Purcell, Head of Partnerships, Cities Programs at the UN Global Compact. And last but not least, our moderator is Olga Joseph. She's former news anchor from NBC News Radio. Please join us in welcoming our legislation and governance panel. Thank you.
Global headlines praised the Paris Agreement. It was signed by 195 parties as the world's first comprehensive climate agreement. It was a promise to take collective action on the threat of climate change. So reducing greenhouse gases, increasing renewables and energy efficiency, financing the response to the reality of climate change. So where are we now, nearly 3.5 years past this landmark legislation? So far, only 185 parties have ratified, and notable handouts include the US, which gave notice of its intent to withdraw from the agreement. Here in New York, April 2019 saw an ambitious energy efficiency bill passed requiring that the city buildings meet a 40% emissions reduction target over the next decade. So this afternoon, we're going to hear from our 4 subject matter experts on what can be done to move these kinds of legislation forward and see some actual change. Joining me on stage here is Mike Mandyke. He is the Executive Officer and Urban Green Council. His experience includes 25 years working with Chief Sustainability Officer for United Technologies. He's also the founding chair for the Corporate Advisory for the World Green Building Council and co-author of the Food Bank. Co-author of a book, Food Foolish. Also on our panel this afternoon, we have Katie Walsh, who is a senior manager with CDP International. It's an organization that basically helps cities and companies kind of get their strategies together, measuring and managing their impact on the environment. She heads the cities and states regions for CDP, and she's basically responsible for outreach and for engagement. Also joining us is Anne Lestrade, former Deputy Mayor of Paris in charge of the water supply and also sanitation and management of Parisian canals. She served as the chair of Eau de Paris, a public company which completely reformed the city's water policy. And we'll hear some best practices from her this afternoon as well. Finally on stage, Patricia Purcell with UN Global Compact, having more than 15 years of experience working with both public and private sector leaders with global commercial sustainability. In other words, how do multinational corporations work within this framework and aid in the efforts? She heads the partnerships and partnerships for the cities program with strategic policy and for program initiatives. So how we're going to format this for now is each panelist is now going to take a couple of minutes just to tell a few facts and figures and insights about their area of expertise and also answer a series of questions that explore the impact of the recent multilateral legislation. Let's get started.
Great. Good afternoon, everybody. Bonjour. My name is John Mandyke. I'm the CEO of the Urban Green Council here in New York City. I don't know if the slides are going to come up or not. The Urban Green Council is a nonprofit environmental organization dedicated to transforming buildings for a sustainable future here in New York City and around the world. And just last month, New York City passed landmark legislation that will produce the largest carbon reduction in the history of any city of the world based on a plan that my organization put together. And the legislation is based on reducing carbon emissions in buildings. And buildings matter because in New York City, buildings consume nearly 70% of all the carbon emissions in our city compared to transportation. Transportation is relatively carbon efficient in New York City. It may not always be on time, but it is carbon efficient, which leaves buildings as the main source of carbon emissions. When you think about buildings in New York City, it's interesting to note that the #1 source of carbon from the building sector actually comes from multifamily housing. We often think of beautiful big buildings like this as the largest sources of carbon, and they certainly are, but the #1 source is in multifamily housing. So what makes this legislation comprehensive is the fact that it covers both commercial and residential applications. Here we go. Just in time for my last slide. How the legislation is going to work is a 40% reduction in carbon emissions for buildings over 25,000 square feet. For those from our friends from Europe, that's 2,300 meters. Those buildings represent 50,000 of the 1 million buildings in New York City, but they represent nearly 60% of the emissions in New York. And so 50,000 buildings are covered. In 2024, there will be a first cap on emissions for the worst performing buildings, about 20% of that stock. And then in 2030, a second cap kicks in to deliver the carbon savings, as you can see here on this slide. About 25% of the properties already covered meet the carbon caps because they're efficient and we've been building in a green manner here in New York. So we're excited about this law. It's revolutionary in the sense of delivering the carbon emissions. Our goal at Urban Green was for this legislation to be extraordinary for the environment, yet feasible and practical to implement. As we get into the panel discussion, I'll be happy to talk about some of those elements that we help shape to make sure that we can actually achieve the reductions in this new law. Thank you.
Great. So good afternoon. My name is Katie Walsh, and I lead the City, States, and Regions program at CDP. So I'm just going to spend a minute or two giving some background on CDP. But just of note today, was particularly excited. My sister works for a French company. She works for Chanel, and I believe there might be some representatives here. And it was exciting to find our two worlds coming together with sustainability and the engagement there and the work we do in climate. So excited about that today. The other thing, on a non-personal note, but personal, is I'm going to take you through an announcement the CDP has today related to cities and climate change. And you are the first public audience in person to receive this information. So I'm going to go through that in our slides. So CDP is formerly the Carbon Disclosure Project. We are working to ensure that we see a thriving economy for people and the planet. And we work with investors, the financial community. We work with states, regions, corporations, their supply chains, and cities in the practice of measurement and disclosing carbon pollution and climate risk and adaptation. So why do cities matter? So John gave us the zoom in terms of why buildings matter in particular, but cities as stakeholders, we know that we have 55% of the world's population living in cities, and you can imagine the world. We are rapidly urbanizing. What is that going to look like in the next 20 years when 80% of the population is living in cities? What do those cities look like? How do people move? How do people consume energy? And so we're really focused on ensuring that we are working with those policy leaders to reduce their emissions and the risk from climate. So last year, we had in the 2018 year for disclosure, that is our main body of work, is we're focusing on having these entities measure, track their emissions and their risks, and then provide that to the public, to the financial market. We had 201, I'll just focus here on North America, we had 201 cities and states and regions participating. And the coverage of that, you can see here we have the sort of darker red is if a state is disclosing to CDP, and then you can also see the number of cities' participation. And I'll talk through a little bit on the trends of what we saw, but of particular note, if you can let your eye see, in Florida, there were 12 cities that disclosed last year. That was a big increase from the year before, and we saw this across the United States, that cities that are experiencing more extreme weather are going through this process now of measuring and disclosing their risks and their emissions associated. So what let's see if I can move this. The announcement for all of you here today is that CDP, for the first time ever, has released a ranking, a scoring for cities. We have done this on the corporate side. It's in our DNA. where we've offered the score as a means to look at your gaps and to look at your opportunities, and we've now released this for cities. And so I can happily say that City of Paris is one of the cities that received an A score, and the City of New York as well as overall 24 in North America, specifically 21 of those are US cities. And I think that also says a lot in terms of this announcement for the intent to withdraw from the Paris Agreement, that you saw a stepping up of leadership in the United States on climate, and on top of that, an excellence in performance. And so when we go through discussion, I'll talk a little bit about what makes an A score, what are those gaps, and what are the things that we need to work on. I thought, here's the name, here are the list of cities, as I noted, New York, and also just that you have this aggregation, particularly in California, in the San Francisco Bay Area. As I'll talk through later, what is the opportunity and what does it mean for all of you that are in the financial markets or that are in the private sector? These are cities leading on climate that are looking for collaboration with the private sector. So this is just a quick snapshot of the number of projects that cities reported that they're seeking investment in. And whether that's in buildings or whether that's in water or infrastructure management, that this is a huge opportunity, and I hope we'll have time to talk about that today.
Thank you for your invitation, and welcome everybody. So I have a very short time, so I wrote a draft, but I won't give some details about experience of the water policy in Paris. But as a former deputy mayor and as chair of Eau de Paris, I led this reform, and we decided to implement a real sustainable water policy in Paris. So first, we decided to remunicipalize. So in the former framework, we had 3 private operators, a joint venture company, public-private in charge of the production, and 2 other private operators in charge of the distribution and billing, the subsidiaries of Suez and Veolia. And we decided to create only one, a unique public company in charge of the whole water cycle. So in charge from the catchment until the billing and the consumer call center. But it wasn't enough for us to have a very sustainable policy. I think, in my point of view, a public-owned company is necessary, but maybe not a sufficient condition to function in a sustainable framework. So we implement many things. First, we open the governance. And it was the first time in France we decided to involve all the stakeholders. So the board now, the board of directors, is open not only toward the elected officials. So we have also, of course, a majority and minority parties represented in the board of directors, but also the civil society. Maybe I can give more detail after. So civil society and also representative of the staff. So all the directors have the same right to vote. They can get all the information. They vote on the very strategic issue. So it's a really open governance inside of the Eau de Paris, the main operator. But also beside that, we have a Parisian Water Observatory. So it's like a platform, a participatory platform to inform for all the information, debate, discussion on water-related issue. But Eau de Paris is a new brand, but also with new information and communication tools. So we launched an overarching communication and information policy with many events, many campaigns to promote, for example, tap water versus bottled water. We create carafe. I don't know if you see, there is a carafe Eau de Paris, designed by the very well-known designer, Les Gourdes. The Gourdes. I have 2 examples here. So, and we have many goals, but this one is it was the first one and very famous because it was designed by Philippe Starck. Philippe Starck is a very famous designer. And so, carafe, voilà. Le pavillon de l'eau, you see la scène sous la surface, is a pavillon de l'eau. So it's a new venue in Paris, a place where we can organize events, exhibitions, scholar programs, many things on water and environmental issue. But we decided also, you see three and four examples of fontaine. So to increase the water accessibility in Paris, so with new fontaine, currently we have more than 1,200 public fontaine with also la pétillante. It's a sparkling water. I can explain after. But beside that, we decided also, of course, to have social and environmental sustainability in our policy. So in very short term. So we decrease the water tariff, the water price by 8%. So it's one of the lowest water price in France. We have also a social fund for households who can pay the bill. We decided also to prohibit the water cuts and to have a campaign also for homeless. And for the social sustainability, we have three strategies. We launched three strategies. So the biodiversity strategy. So we have ecological continuities, a green and a blue belt. We have also a plan, a water energy nexus plan. So we have a very ambitious goal to reduce greenhouse gas emission by 15% by 2020, to reduce energy consumption by 12%, and also to increase the renewable energy by photovoltaic and a very innovative, for example, geothermal energy plant. And I will conclude with that. We have also a protection strategy. So we Eau de Paris partners with farmers, because maybe you don't know, but in 3 minutes I can't explain. We did a lot, and I can explain everything. But for to supply Paris in water, all the water comes from surface water and from groundwater resources. So we have a big fields and a big catchment areas. So in this catchment area, there is a big issue to protect the quality of water and to fight against the pollution. So we work with farmers to encourage farming, organic farming methods and agroecology. So, in conclusion, we really wanted to have a cross-cutting policy and to have a holistic approach of the sustainability, socio-economic aspect, but also environmental and democracy aspect. And we were awarded by the United Nations for our policy. And I can say that we implement the new water policy for people, planet, not for profit, but for the common good.
Thank you.
Yes, I forgot my conclusion.
Okay. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for inviting us to be here today, and congratulations. I understand it's the inaugural, so it's quite an honor, and I hope that we're setting a good precedent for the future collaboration here. You've already heard from my executive director and CEO what UN Global Compact is about, so I don't need to go into that. The cities program was launched actually quite some time ago, about 18 years ago, with the former Secretary General Kofi Annan, and the UN Global Compact's office in Melbourne, with the City of Melbourne and Royal Melbourne Institute of Technology. Quite why Melbourne, we actually don't know, but it's a relationship that we still maintain to this day. But only last year did the cities program really sort of pivot from what had been focused really on more sort of normative work with cities and a lot of focus on Australian cities to a global program that I'm now running in the New York office, which is about delivering shared value between UN Global Compact companies and the cities that we're working with, not only through the cities program, but also through our other city network partners like C40 Cities, who I know my colleague Katie also works very closely with, but also other global city networks that are working on a variety of different areas of the SDGs, climate, energy, et cetera. So what does that mean by delivering shared value? Well, first of all, it's recognizing that there is often a disconnect in the way that the investor and the business community think, and what they perceive as what their needs are, and what the city may perceive or the local government might perceive as its priorities. And so in order to develop programs that are going to have an impact and achieve the SDGs at scale, then we're going to need to actually work on improving this dialogue between governments, local governments and investors and the business community. So our starting point is actually there. It's also, here's just a snapshot of some of the cities where we're working. It's, as I mentioned, a global program. So, but a lot of the focus really is on cities in middle-income countries and developing countries, particularly in Africa and South Asia, which are facing the most rapid urban growth, and will continue to do so over the coming several years. And why is this interesting for companies? And this is really in investors what we're working towards now. These new markets and these new opportunities that are there for investors, and how can we go about as the UN, but also with our other partners and working closely with government to create the right enabling environment for those investments to flow? How do we actually support the development of local labor markets? How do we actually facilitate a competitive environment that makes the barriers to entry lower for companies and investors to come in, particularly in these sort of high-risk zones and cities. We need to also focus on, here's just an example of some of the SDG priorities that the cities that are participating in our program have told us. It's interesting that decent work, I mean, obviously SDG 11 is not a surprise, but decent work and health and well-being come out a lot, and I think that's also corresponding to the focus on these developing country cities, which of course, you know, many of them have a large informal employment market, mostly informal. Informal transport is sort of the main form of transport, informal housing. So here, you know, you can see that there's a clear correlation between the actual sort of conditions on the ground there, where they're also facing many health issues, air pollution, and intense threats of climate change. So these are some of the priorities that we're trying to sort of align with the companies where we're working and see where is there a good market opportunity and expertise among the companies within the UN Global Compact that can help to support sort of the co-creation of solutions that address some of these SDG priorities, but critically trigger investments so that they're implementable and scalable. And so the final thing to say on that point is really about this moving, shifting from small-scale project-based approach to really a longer-term investments that can go to scale and have measurable impact, and start really thinking about cities. We can think about them as entities, but also thinking about them as places. So really a place-based approach to development and investment that has an impact on people. Thank you.
All right, we're going to get into a few questions now. First, a few among the panel here, and then we'll open it up to audience discussion as well to make sure that your voices are heard and your ideas are expressed. Katie, I'd like to start with you. With today's release of the A city list, what exactly is the CDP measuring for the uninitiated, and why is it important to have this kind of transparency?
Great. So I mentioned, so CDP, what we do is disclosure reporting. So there are many, I know of the companies that are here, many of you go through this process of reporting to CDP, and you have been scored since the beginning. So scoring is the DNA of disclosure and measurement transparency. And the goal of that effort is that you can identify gaps in your climate planning, and that information then can be used for financial and policy decision making. So why are we scoring cities, and why did we decide to release scores for cities this year and frankly today? We have looked at the benefits that companies have received from scoring to use those gaps and the transformation that has had in raising ambition and accelerating best practice on the corporate side. And municipalities have many different considerations and things that they have to take into account. In addition to economic development, they're also looking at social vulnerabilities. And climate is another characteristic of things that cities are looking at and trying to identify how to work on. But as we all saw, and we had the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report that came out in October of last year, which basically, as you all know, or should know, we are not on track for that 1.5 degrees Celsius world that we all need to live in. It's not happening with national governments, and it's not happening with the commitments that have been made. It has to be ensuring ourselves and our future livelihoods. We need the role of the corporate sector, we need the financial community, and we need cities, states, and regions. So that report created this sense of urgency that we need to do as much as we can to demonstrate what ambition and best practice is. And so we were scoring cities in the 2018 year, and then decided to be able to put out and give cities an example of what they need to do. And so I'll just say very briefly, an A-score city from 2018 is going to have a city adaptation plan. They're going to demonstrate how they're adapting to climate change. They're going to be setting citywide emission targets, so not just for their local government, but citywide emission targets, and specifically also that they're measuring those emissions associated. And so it's these characteristics that are essential that we want to ensure that all cities are doing their part.
So if these types of initiatives and programs have been in place for many different cities, what makes one city's program more effective than another? Are there innovations that need to be made? Are folks coming up with new ideas and new approaches? How can we best avoid a kind of a one-size-fits-all solution? But then again, you're scoring them on a scorecard. Where is the flexibility in what works in city A might not work in city B?
Yeah, so I think I'm going to let John do all the New York City talking, and I'll just give an example of something that we saw that I think is innovative and new and different, and again, which speaks to this audience. So the City of London is looking at another city, again, leading on climate, and they're looking at what do they have control over for their own emissions. So they have set a carbon neutral goal, and they're looking at how much they can actually do within their city, and they only control about 10% of the emissions that are happening within the city. 40% of those emissions, right, this happens because you do a greenhouse gas inventory, 40% of those emissions are coming from the workplace. So they're coming from the companies that have a big footprint, that have employees that are operating in the city. So something innovative and different that they've done, which is an example that can be replicated, suited to who's in your city and who's operating. City of London, the mayor works specifically with 11 major businesses. Some of them are headquartered there, and some of them just have major operations like Tesco, which is equivalent supermarket. And then those companies are the leadership group that are committed to setting certain targets in buildings, in energy infrastructure, with renewable energy goals, with transportation. And so I think understanding the city's ability, how much can they control to make and reduce emissions, and then what can they do to create the environment to bring more to the table. And I think the New York example and the work that you specifically did, I think is really exciting and representative of what's possible.
So let's bring John into the conversation, because you mentioned the big footprint. What city in the U.S. has a big footprint? New York certainly does. So what are we doing in terms of the current legislation in New York, and why are the new innovations going to serve us better?
Well, I mean, this is, in my estimation, this will be the largest disruption in the history of New York City real estate. Real estate's our #1 asset class in New York, as it is in the United States, as it is around the world. And so when you ask this asset class to reduce carbon emissions 40% by 2030, it's over a 2005 baseline, a lot of work is going to have to be done. And so what we did at Urban Green is to make sure that this law would be feasible, is we had certain elements built in that would make it feasible. So there is a examination for how carbon trading could work with buildings in this new law. I'm very excited about that because carbon trading could be a breakthrough policy tool for cities and how they look at their built environment. Because it doesn't matter what your political structure is, what your climate is, what your building stock is, carbon trading can work in any city of the world. And so we're excited about that and we'll be working with that. Another feasible item is that buildings can offset their emissions requirements by buying renewable power. That's important because we need a strong market signal in New York City. 70% of our grid is from fossil fuel-based sources. And so that renewable power offset will create demand for a greener power that will help green our grid.
So let's discuss the financial benefit. Every business owner wants a return on investment. Why is this good investment for business?
Well, it's good investment in the sense that we need to manage risk. So New York State has $3 trillion of insured coastal properties. That's twice the GDP of Canada. We're a global city, but we're a coastal city. So we have a lot at stake. We have a lot at risk. We have to do our part to reduce climate emissions, to lower that climate risk, but we also have an obligation to do it in a way that other cities can also act, because we're going to spend billions and billions of dollars to implement this new law. If no other cities act, New York Harbor is still going to flood because we live in a global climate system. So we want to find policies that we can learn from, but also policies that we can export, like carbon trading, to give ourselves collectively the best shot.
So are you optimistic, or?
I'm optimistically nervous. The carbon caps, make no mistake about them, are very, very, very difficult. Billions and billions of dollars will be spent by the real estate industry to meet them. They're not all happy about it, and I get it. But we worked really hard to make sure that there were aspects of the law that would make the implementation more feasible, like we just talked about, and that gives me hope that we can get there.
Well, let's bring in Patricia now, because when you talk about making these kinds of changes, it does require forging new partnerships, listening and understanding stakeholders' needs. What can you tell us about progress that we've been making globally on our sustainability goals? Everybody has the idea, but are we approaching it the right way?
Yeah, I mean, I think you saw some of that from Lisa's presentation earlier in terms of progress made in poverty reduction. But the threat from climate change, growing rates of inequality, which are affecting all cities around the world, these are quite worrying issues. I mean, when we look at what needs to be achieved in terms of the investment just on infrastructure, if you're going to, most of the infrastructure in the world in cities has yet to be built still, right? So there's of course the New Yorks of the world, but where the urban growth is happening the fastest. That whole landscape is being built now and will continue to be built. So you're either going to lock in future emissions and pollutions and inequalities and all of the other sort of potential negative social impacts, or you're going to completely disrupt the world as we know it and be completely innovative in places that are sort of they're fresh markets right now. I mean, we see that within the fintech industry, for example, which is, miles ahead, totally leapfrogging in other markets like in China, where the traditional credit card isn't really, it's not there anymore. It's a completely different thing. You look at the millennial generation and how they're interacting with traditional banking or not, and it's a completely different approach to how we sort of buy and trade and deliver on services. So I think there's a lot of, yes, of course there are risks, but I think what's driving the investment is, again, these market opportunities. So if we look just at infrastructure alone, we hear about these big numbers, like $90 trillion, or $2.5 to $4 trillion per year by 2030 that's going to need to be invested just in infrastructure, resilient infrastructure, to help achieve some of the SDGs. So how we actually, mobilize that investment, there needs to be a good business case. And I think, everyone just needs to realize that. On the local, on the government side, the priority is very much about, election cycles and politics, but any investments, need to actually be sustainable past those political cycles. Right. So how do you, put the right sort of ingredients or frameworks in place, incentives in place, regulatory frameworks in place that will enable that sustainability, because those investments are not going to be just for 1 year or 2 years. So one of the things that we just launched recently to help sort of mobilize this is a new expert group on investment in the SDGs in cities. And one of the projects and we launched it in Paris actually with our partner OECD. And one of the first projects we'll be working on is creating an investor prospectus, which can look at portfolios of projects and then see what's missing, from those portfolios of projects, and how they can be investable and sustainable and critically scalable.
In a statement, where can cities do better? Where is the room for improvement in devising these partnerships?
It's bringing in the investor and business voice very early on. I mean, too often local governments, cities would, it goes for any government, I suppose, but particularly on the local level side, will go to a business or to an investor and say, here's what I want to do, here are my priorities. And they'll say, well, that's great, I wish you would have told me that a bit earlier on, because then I would have, we could have worked together on what actually, shared value looks like. Because now you're sort of too far along and we don't see ourselves in this picture. And businesses need to see themselves in that picture of development. Of course, it's going to deliver social value and all of that. That's the idea of bringing the two entities together. But there's not enough of engagement and a deep mistrust, actually, between local government towards business. So I think that is something cities can definitely work on.
Okay. Well, Anne on our panel can definitely speak to forging those kinds of partnerships and bringing in the inclusion early on. How did Paris tackle that, of being user-focused in their reform of their water policy?
First of all, it was a political will, in fact. As deputy mayor, I would like to have checks and balances governance. So it means, because as usual, it's only the elected official who decide, who discuss and debate and vote. And it was very, for me and also for the mayor of Paris to try to involve all the citizens, and not only citizens as consumer, but also the other stakeholders. That's why I gave the example of the farmers for our strategy of protection groundwater resources. So we decided to create a new observatory. It was, yes, as I said, a political will to open the governance. And really, it's very important to see that I can say that 10 years after, it's a success. It's not because it's...
so early
I decided that, but
engagement.
it's a successful, because even now, nobody contests the success. And even for the minority opposition party, no party want to go back to the former governance. Okay. So I think it's a success when everybody, even agreed on that.
So early inclusion, active listening. Any questions from our audience? Any concerns?
Can I chime in?
Sure, go right ahead.
I was just kind of reflecting back on this question of the call to action to cities, and I know that we have a lot of business and financial community here. I think the call to action goes to all of you, and that specifically is, if you what are you doing in your own corporation to measure and manage the risk from climate? Do you know the cities where you have employees and you have operations? What are those cities doing? How are people going to get to work if the city is not working on climate? And that, again, public disclosure, and CDP is one tool, but there should be a conversation happening if it's not already. And for the financial market community, if you're making purchases, if you're buying bonds, if you're investing in bonds, how are those cities going to be? Is City Hall going to be around in 100 years? Is it going to be underwater? Is there going to be climate refugees moving around? And these are decisions that need to be incorporated in, both from a financial and then also from a corporate sustainability angle. Ensuring that your global sustainability plans align with what is happening at a local level in terms of supporting local laws and policies and making sure that there's not a disconnect between what is globally espoused for sustainability, but actually how that connects at the local governance level.
Well, unfortunately, we are out of time and we won't be able to take your questions just yet, but if you'd like to approach the panels later during the afternoon and evening session, they will be available for you. Thanks for your attention, and can we have a round of applause for our panelists, please? Thank you.
So many thanks again to our legislation and governance panel. For those of you that are interested in attending the food, beverage, hospitality panel, that will take place in this room. And the transportation and energy panel will take place just across the hallway in the breakout room. So please make that change now. There will be a break following the next round of panels, so we would ask you to move into the other room quite quickly. And we'll continue and then take a break afterwards. Thank you.